The Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF, or SCHD, is one of my all-time favorite buy and hold positions for my dividend growth portfolios. And as of filming this video, you can see right here on my master dividend tracker that when it comes to SCHD, across all my portfolios, I currently have around 515 shares and adding more and more every single day. And side note, you can grab this exact dividend tracker for yourself. It's the first link in my description. But even though SCHD has a ton of great things to offer, and stay tuned because I'm going to explain every single one of those things. There is one issue when it comes to SCHD, and we have to talk about in this video, and it's the overall portfolio and the top 10 holdings more or less when it comes to SCHD. Now, if you currently own any shares of SCHD or have ever planned on it, make sure to stick around because you are not going to want to miss a thing. I just finished my brand new dividend investing ebook where I share exactly how I went from zero to now over 7 figures invested, and also on how I earned more than $6,000 per month in dividends. I also finished my custom dividend tracker that you can use to track your dividend income progress on an ongoing basis. So make sure to grab yourself a copy of my dividend investing ebook and the new dividend tracker today. It's the first link in my description. So first, before we go over some of the issues with SCHD's holdings, and trust me, there's definitely some issues there. I first want to explain to everyone why this ETF is my favorite buy and hold position for my specific strategy when it comes to long-term dividend growth investing, and why I think this ETF could be perfect for other dividend growth investors out there. Now, the main reasons being is that this ETF pretty much offers everything, exactly what I'm looking for as a long-term dividend growth investor. Now, first of all, simple things like the expense ratio. The expense ratio is just 0.06%, which, keep in mind, expense ratio is something that a lot of long-term investors don't think too much about, but trust me, once you own a lot of shares of a different ETF, an expense ratio can definitely add up, and that's something that you're going to want to mitigate early on. Now, also, SCHD does have the potential to keep growing and growing and growing over time as far as ETF price. At least historically speaking, SCHD is up 188% plus, and trust me, I get it, over the last year or so, SCHD has not performed all that well. The ETF has been pretty much trading sideways and even down for a majority of time over the past, say, 3 or so years, but as a long-term dividend growth investor, I'm hoping that this is offering a potential blip in time buying opportunity, which I have been taking full advantage of. So we talked about the fact that SCHD has a cheap expense ratio, which is going to help investors long-term. Also, the fact that SCHD has grown over time, which means that as I buy more and more shares, hopefully at least they'll go up over time, making my overall net worth rise along with it. But also because I am sort of a dividend income focused investor, meaning that I do like to see my portfolio move up in value over time, but I also am pretty much just as concerned about cash flow and dividends paid to me consistently. Because as a 31-year-old dividend growth investor with over 7 figures invested currently, I'm definitely hoping that, say, over the next 3 to 5 years, I can potentially use some of my dividend income to pay for some bills, if I so choose to do so, and if not, use the dividend income for just maybe some travel, or maybe even to take care of some of my friends or family. So with that being a big portion of my strategy, SCHD is a perfect candidate when it comes to that, because this ETF offers a starting yield of around 3.5%, which, again, there's definitely higher yielding ETFs and stocks out there. I know that. Trust me, I have tons of them in my portfolio personally. But with an ETF of this caliber and the fact that it does have so much growth potential long term, a 3.5% starting dividend yield more or less is definitely very fair and not bad at all. Not to mention SCHD has some significant dividend growth. And this is one of the main things that dividend growth investors always talk about when it comes to SCHD. The fact that if you buy a share today, most likely you'll get paid more and more over time in dividends. That's a huge selling point when it comes to CTF. And it's definitely been the case so far since I started buying SCHD even a few years back. Considering, for example, back in December of 2021, the ETF was paying 62 cents per share. Now, just this last December, we got paid 74 cents per share in the same month of December, which is a nice bump, a nice pay increase for doing absolutely nothing but holding onto the share. Now, the other thing I like about SCHD is the overall objective and the overall methodology of the Dow Jones US Dividend 100 Index, which is the index that SCHD tracks. Now, I've made videos about this index and definitely check them out throughout my channel, but this is also sort of where we find a little bit of a problem here. Now, before we go over some of the top holdings and we talk about some of the issues with these top holdings when it comes to SCHD, we have to make one thing clear. The Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF does go through a reconstitution. I think it's early March, so that should be coming up here, where different stocks are going to be added and taken out, depending on if they make the cut, basically. And over time, that reconstitution has been definitely helpful, considering the ETF has been able to cut off a lot of fat, so to speak, within the ETF's holdings and hopefully bring in more and more high quality holdings over time. But even with the reconstitution, we have to be completely honest with ourselves here. As SCHD shareholders, like I showed you, I currently own well over 500 shares for my portfolios. I myself, as a long-term buy and hold SCHD holder, am not completely excited about all these top 10 holdings, not to mention a lot of holdings that are a little bit further down the list. Now, the way some of the stocks get inside the Dow Jones US Dividend 100 Index is they have to meet certain requirements like pay dividends for a certain time period, be at a certain market cap, etc., etc. But some of the top holdings within SCHD have not performed well over the past, say, 1 or 2 years now, which has definitely been dragging down the ETF and a concern, especially if you're like myself and you're planning on buying a ton of shares of SCHD long term. Because after all, for every share of SCHD that you own, you are getting direct exposure to things like Broadcom, Merrick, AbbVie, even things like Cisco, which I personally sold off out of my portfolio, things like Verizon, which I already have 1,200 shares of Verizon, and I wish I didn't have 1,200 shares of Verizon, even things like Coca-Cola, which haven't performed all that well, at least as of recently, even things like Pfizer stock, just as of recently hit a brand new 52-week low. Now, the great thing about owning an ETF like SCHD, or pretty much like any other ETF, I guess, is that you are getting exposure to multiple different holdings, and the diversification factor is one of my favorite things about buying ETFs because I don't have to really study or research every single one of these holdings, knowing that I'm only getting a relatively small amount of exposure to every single one of them. So even if, say, Snap-on has a bad quarter or bad year, Snap-on's only 0.46% of the overall portfolio, so it's not going to make or break the ETF. And that's exactly why I'm such a big fan of ETFs moving forward, and that's why my strategy is to buy shares of SCHD ongoingly. But that being said, I do think that we all have to be honest here and admit that there's some top holdings in this ETF, not to name any names, but I want you guys to comment some of the names that you think down below that we're not really happy with having all that much exposure to, considering something like Verizon currently is around 4% of the overall ETF, which, like I said a second ago, I don't hate Verizon. I own tons of shares of Verizon, but long term, I would rather have something else in its place. Now, what a lot of you guys are probably saying is, well, you don't have to buy SCHD. There's plenty of other different dividend growth ETFs out there that do offer similar things to SCHD, but might have better basket of holdings. And I totally agree with you. If we look at something like the Wisdom Tree DGRW ETF, the Quality Dividend Growth Fund, which is also one of my favorite dividend growth ETFs. Now, DGRW does have a little bit more expensive of an expense ratio at 0.28%. DGRW also does pay a dividend monthly though, but looking at some of the top 10 holdings of DGRW, look at just how great some of these companies are. We have things like Microsoft making up almost 8% of the ETF, which I love. We have Apple stock, also a huge fan of Apple. We have things like AbbVie, Johnson & Johnson, Broadcom, the Home Depot, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and then here again we have things like Cisco, Nvidia, etc., etc. Now, I just share this with all of you to make it very clear that even if you are a huge fan of an ETF's price return over time, even if you love the starting dividend yield that the ETF has, and even the methodology that the index follows, I think it's definitely a fair, important reminder to all of us that if and when you buy into one of these ETFs, you are getting exposure to whatever holdings are within the ETF. And some of the holdings within certain ETFs are definitely better than others. So for that reason, I most likely plan on building out a position in the Schwab US Dividend Equity ETF for the rest of this year. Following this year, I most likely will start building out a position in something like VIG, DGRW, or maybe even VU. But now after all that, I want to hear from you guys down below when it comes to SCHD and SCHD's top holdings. If you personally had to pick one of your least favorite top 10 holdings in this ETF, which one would it be and why? Drop it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.